Good afternoon once again. Jeff Benson coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida. Really appreciate everybody taking their time out of a busy day to listen to a few stories, and we'll talk about some builder's risk today. This is all on the ongoing educational webinars that we've been doing for a while now. And just to give you a little background, when people say tenant build-outs or when they say renovations, it's probably about a third of what we do as a builder's risk program is insure renovations. That could be either what we call a tenant build out, which doesn't have an existing structure. Sometimes they do have an existing structure. We'll call that something else, renovations, remodeling. And then about 2/3 of what we do is ground up new construction. Some of the underwriting rules and philosophies are the same, and then for ground up new and for renovations. But we're going to stress the ones that are different today. So I think what we'll do is run through this fairly quickly, and then we'll open it up for questions. One thing I will say too, as far as renovations go, they take place all over the United States. We insure renovations literally from coast to coast and all points in between. And what we're trying to get to is to make sure that everybody is properly covered for what the exposures are. So once again, the ins and outs of tenant build-outs. Let's dive into it. First of all, a very brief summary of COPE. COPE doesn't change in builder's risk. It is because a lot of times people, for whatever reason, they submit a tenant build out and they forget to answer the very basic questions that we need. So construction, what is the construction of the building that's being renovated or the build out's taking place? It might be a multi-story building in Manhattan, or it might be a little gas station in Nashville, or something in between those two. So it could be all different kinds of things, but we need to know the construction: frame, joisted masonry, non-combustible, masonry non-combustible, fire resistive, modified fire resistive, and all of those things affect the rate. So that's why we need to know that. The occupancy, things like, is it going to be occupied while they're renovating it? Obviously, that's a big exposure to us. What's the intended occupancy? We need to know that. Okay, we'll get into those in a little more detail, but we need to know what the occupancy is. The protection, yes, we need to know the ISO protection class. You can pick 1 to 10. We have to know what it is. Once again, that is one of the underwriting factors that affect the pricing. And lastly is the exposure. We do underwrite these based on where they're located. If they're on the beach in Miami, that's one set of questions. If they're in a high rise in Chicago, that's another set of questions. So we need to know where it's located. If we talk about anything today, if you learn anything or think about anything as we walk away today, it's really, what is the scope of the project? So I always use the term scope, and some people don't, they get a little confused. So the plainest I can be is, what are they doing? What are they doing as far as part of the renovations? We'll receive an application, or we'll receive a letter, the agent will say they're going to do an interior gut rehab. So I'm sitting there scratching my head. I mean, that can mean a lot of things, an interior gut rehab. So we need to know a detailed description of the scope of the project. And what we're trying to determine on this is one of these three things. Is it non-structural? It truly is just interior rehab. They're going to put new flooring in, new lighting in. They're going to put some new furniture in there. Maybe they're going to do some electrical and plumbing, but everything they're doing is non-structural. The next one I'd be considered minor structural. Maybe they're just putting new windows in. Maybe they're doing like a doorway, things like that. They're not affecting any load-bearing walls. That would be minor structural. The third one would be structural. If they are moving load-bearing walls, or they're adding floors to an existing building, they're doing elevator work, they're doing foundation work, basement work, footing work. These are major structural things that affect the integrity of the building, and the underwriter is going to need to know that. So keep in mind, non-structural is the easiest, minor structural is not too bad, structural gets a lot harder to underwrite and to write the business. The existing structure, even though we might not be insuring the existing structure, maybe we're only insuring the renovations, but in that case, we want you to confirm the coverage is in place on the building, the existing building. Because sometimes when you mix the two, we have a claim nightmare. So you have one carrier that's on the existing structure and then another carrier on the renovations. So you can see in the event of a claim, it can be a lot of whose fault was it, what actually took place. So usually we don't like to do that. We'd rather insure the whole thing if we could. But sometimes, let's say we had one submitted the other day and it was a gymnasium was being added at a school. The school had a master policy, so the property was covered, the existing structure, but the renovations to the gym that was taking place is what we insured. That makes sense. That's logical. So we're just going to need you to confirm coverage, and you need to do that for your insured on the existing building. Another thing on the existing is what is the occupancy? Maybe we're just doing a build out on part of the building. What is the other part of the building being occupied as? Think about a strip center. Maybe you're just renovating one of the retail locations in the strip center, but right next door is a restaurant that's going to be occupied. So you can see how the surrounding properties would change the exposure. Another example is historical. If this isn't a historical district or it has a historical designation, the underwriter's going to need to know that. So keep that in mind. The length of the project, we see this all the time. We don't really like to do ones less than 3 months. That's just kind of our underwriting. Would we entertain it? Possibly. You'd have to call us. But we see a lot of 3 month, 6 month projects. I get asked all the time, what should I write the policy for? And I answer like, well, how long is the project going to take? I mean, that's pretty much what we want to write it for. So if it's a 6 month project, let's do a 6 month policy. Or it's an 8 month project, let's do an 8 month policy. Right? Or, you know, if you want to go over a little bit, that probably makes sense too, to make sure it's covered properly. And here's a big one. Another thing I need to learn today, you need to learn today is an extension. Let's say you wrote it for 3 months, but there was a COVID pandemic and it's going to take another 3 months. You have to notify the underwriter in order to extend that. It doesn't automatically extend. Most of the time, the carriers will not notify you. They won't say, do you want to extend, like they do with ground up new. With these things, you need to know that. So you need to call the underwriter and explain what happened and say, I need more coverage, more length of time. So keep in mind, you can't go back through a lot of this as we talk about it. And a lot of it's just communication with the underwriter. Whatever questions concerns you have, pick up the phone and call them, send them an email. This is another thing we see a lot of times, the renovations. So they start out with very good intentions. They're just going to do an interior rehab. They're not going to change any load-bearing walls. Everything's fine. But they get in there and they start taking things apart, and it's an older building, and all of a sudden they see wood rot. They see insect damage. This damage is to a load-bearing beam or a wall. So the builder says, oh, no problem, I can fix that. Well, what we've seen, we've actually had some very large claims where a builder thinks they can fix it. They've never done it before. So guess what? They start messing with the load-bearing wall, and what happens? The entire building collapses. We have actually had a fair amount of that. It is the #1 concern we have with tenant buildouts, is that they go beyond the scope of what they originally thought they were going to do. So what I guess you need to know is you need to tell your builder that, because if the builder gets beyond their level of expertise, that's where they have a problem. So a lot of it's just underwriting the builder to make sure they know what they're doing. So another thing that we've seen a lot of, and this is, we could probably work with you on some type of blanket policy or some type of reporting form. Let's say you have a builder that does one thing. I have a good friend of mine that builds Jimmy John's sandwich shops. He built over 40 of them last year. He builds them over and over again all around the Southeast, and he does them the exact same way. And he's very good at it. So what you could do for a contractor like that is some type of reporting form, as long as they're building the same build out over and over again. Just a good way of doing it. That would be, we see a lot of that with fast food restaurants. Like I said, with retail, any of the large franchises, you'll have certain builders that specialize in franchise build outs. It's good business, love to do it. A lot of times it is superior construction, usually non-combustible or masonry non-combustible. So it's good business, just a good way to do it. We'd love to write those for you. Oops, let me go back one. Dang, I went too far. Slide too far. Oh, well, let's see. How do I do next slide, previous slide? Don't know how to do it. All right, let's keep going. Lost control. This is another, just thinking about this. So is it going to be occupied during construction? Like I said, we had an example of a school not too long ago that was being renovated and they were actually still going to be in school. So you can see from an underwriting standpoint, the questions we're going to ask is, how are they going to protect the job site? Obviously, you don't want people in the job site during the day, so that has to be protected. It has to be walled off somehow. And then especially at night too, how is it going to be protected? Do they remove the debris daily? Because as debris builds up, that's a fire hazard, you know that. So we would ask that question. And as I said earlier, protection of job site after hours. We need to know protection after hours, because a lot of times build out of a strip center, so the strip center is operational. A lot of activity, a lot of people walking by. We need to know how it's going to be secured at night. Oh, there we go. That happened. Previous. Like a delay in there. Intended occupancy. We're going to talk about that for a second too. So it does affect the underwriting of these risks. So is it manufacturing? What we're concerned about in manufacturing is highly specialized and expensive equipment. Sometimes we'll see a build out as maybe it's $1 million build out, but 700,000 of that is one piece of machinery. So the underwriter is going to ask a lot of questions about that piece of machinery, and they might decide not to do it because it's too specialized. If something happens to it, how are you going to replace it? So that's a big thing on the manufacturing. Same thing with medical offices. I've seen where, you know, they have imaging machines and stuff like that are very, very expensive and specialized. So just make sure that you tell the underwriter what they're up to. And the restaurants, we see that a lot. We're going to ask a lot of questions about the particular type of equipment they're going to be using in the restaurant, because there's a lot of values there. And obviously, if you had an occupied restaurant that was being renovated, that's probably one of the more hazardous things that we'll take a look at. So just keep that in mind. We did lost control. Next slide. There we go. Let's talk about some examples of tenant build outs that we see. We see these every day. Like I said, we underwrite these things every day, and we do it. I was looking at one yesterday in New York. We did one in the state of Washington not too long ago. These build outs occur all over the place. We see a lot of office build outs. We see a lot of restaurants. We see a lot of retail. When I say retail, it could be any of the strip centers, or even sometimes I consider the delis and sub shops and all that. They're more retail than they are restaurants, but we see a lot of that. Another thing we see is a lot of conversions. You'll have a building that's maybe been a warehouse, and now it's going to be repurposed as habitational. What we're concerned about in these conversions would be load-bearing structural changes. If they're not doing that, that's good. If they are, it requires a lot of underwriting, and some underwriters will walk away from the risk if there's too much structural stuff being done. So the conversions, we just have to wait and see. We see a lot of that. I've seen a lot of it even in some of the high-rise condos where someone's going to buy 2 units and combine them into 1 unit. We had one of those the other day, and it was like a very expensive tenant build out. But they were not doing structural work, so it wasn't too bad. So hopefully that answers a lot of your questions on tenant build outs. It's a good business as long as the proper information is given to the underwriter. You know, like I said, it's probably about 1/3 of what we do. And, you know, depending on, I always thought it's a good hedge against the economy. So what happens when maybe the economy slows down or they're not building as much new stuff, they're still fixing up the old stuff. And so there is always a lot of tenant build outs going on. There's a lot of renovations, remodeling work going on. It does require maybe more specialized underwriting, especially on the existing structure. So you need to deal with a carrier and underwriter that's comfortable with that. and understands what's going on. We see a lot of the urban areas where there's the row houses being renovated. You just got to be careful. Once again, if they're doing underground work, you can imagine if you do underground work on a row house, you have the possibility of collapsing the whole building. So that's not good. So you really have to have contractors that are experienced. And that's a big part of the underwriting. I mean, I just trust that enough. Is just knowing that the builder has done this before, they know what they're doing. That's critical to the success of this. So what we're going to do now is real quick. Our next webinar, which will be sometime in November, we'll get back to you on November 18th, it's there, will be who is insured. Another critical piece of builder's risk is, are we insuring the builder, general contractor? Are we insuring the subcontractor? Are we insuring the owner or the developer? There's a lot of different entities that have a financial interest in the project. We need to make sure we cover all of those. So we're going to build a little webinar around that. I think you'll find that interesting. Once again, this is all about making sure that everybody is properly covered for the exposures that are out there. And it's a highly specialized line of business. That's why we spend so much time on builder's risk. So there you have it, the ins and outs of tenant buildouts. What we're going to do now is take a few minutes and answer some questions. So hopefully there's some questions out there. Darcy, do we have any questions?
Hey, Jeff. Yeah, here is our first question. How flexible can you be relative to term of policy?
Good question. How flexible can we be in the term of the policy? So let's think about that. I said earlier that you see a lot of these are 3 months or 6 months, but the answer that I always give is, well, first of all, how long is the project going to take? Now, these things can vary, maybe even more than ground up new, because they think they're going to get in there and it's going to be very quick, and they discover there's more work to be done than they thought, or there are delays. Sometimes there's delays in the permitting process. Sometimes there's delays, in supplies, labor, COVID, whatever it may be. So the answer is whatever it needs to be as far as now they will. If you ask us to do a year policy on a $100,000 build out, we're going to ask a lot of questions because that doesn't make a lot of sense. So we're going to ask the question, but whatever it takes to properly write the risk is what we would ultimately try to get to. Good question.
All right, next question. Are tenant improvements written at replacement cost?
Are tenant improvements written at replacement cost? Another good question. So usually, in most cases, the existing structure is actual cash value, and the renovations that take place are at replacement cost. So the answer to the question on tenant build-outs is it is at replacement cost, because it is at whatever happens to that equipment. There's no depreciation on what you're doing. So it is theoretically at replacement cost for the amount of the renovations, not the existing structure. Good question.
All right, this one's a longer question. If the builder's risk markets are hardening, what measures can contractors take on tenant build-outs or implementations on site in order to keep it competitive with premium during a stronger economy?
I guess, I think I interpret that as more of a loss control. What can they do to make them better than another contractor, maybe to get better pricing, preferred pricing? It kind of goes back to what we said on all the loss control. First of all, make sure they stick to what they know. So if they're within the scope of their experience, that's number one. That's good because an underwriter will pick up on that. Number two would be any job site safety things they can do, from all the typical things, but like I said, removing debris every day, protecting the job site during the day and at night. Those will make it more favorable. I would assume they would get better pricing in that case. I think that's about all we can do at this part. And the market is hardening a little bit, guys. We're starting to see rates go up a little bit, not dramatically, but some. So that's actually, from an underwriter standpoint, I kind of like that. I like the rates going up, but this is all about loss control and staying safe, keeping the job safe.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Next question. How does builder's risk differ from installation floaters for tenant improvements? specifically, are all parties covered under an installation floater as they are in most builder's risk?
So it's like a two-part question. We'll go with that first. So first of all, a builder's risk is really just a super installation floater. It really is the same thing. The installation floater is written for an individual trade. So I'm an electrical contractor. I want to insure only what I'm doing. So I write an installation floater. Builder's risk is then, it'll be written usually in the name of a general contractor, and automatically all the subs that are involved will be covered. So it's like a group of installation floaters under one policy. And on the tenant build-outs, I've seen it done where all they want to do is ensure what they're doing. So the plumber gets an installation floater, so his interest is protected and what he's doing is protected. Probably to me, a better way to do would be to write what more like a builder's risk policy on the tenant build-out in the name of the general contractor. And then most policies, at least you'd have to make sure, you need to verify, but the interest of all the subs would be covered. So it would be very similar to builder's risk, and for a ground up new entire house, the entire project is covered. Very good question. We'll get into that in a little more detail in our next webinar when we talk about who's an insured too. You have to kind of think about that. But good question.
All right. Are you ever able to insure the existing structure at replacement cost?
I mean, the easy answer for me would be to say no, because usually it's older building. I guess if it was a really new building and they were going to do something to it, maybe, but it's really based on the age of a building. An older building's not going to be written at replacement cost. It's going to be written at ACV. I don't know of any underwriters that would do that. That would be kind of a leap of faith because there's depreciation involved in everything. And so you have to calculate that into the ACV. Having said that, there is an endorsement. There's an AAIS endorsement that we insure, that we use, called stated value. So basically what you do is you come to me and say, I think the building's worth this. I look at it, I do a cost estimator on the per square foot. You and I come to an agreement on the stated value of the structure, and that's what we write it at. So in effect, I guess you're kind of doing replacement costs, but you're doing an agreed value. So there should not be any co-insurance concerns in that case. So just remember, stated value, or used to be called agreed amount. I think they kind of changed the name of it, but it's the same concept for older buildings, and that's how we do it. So good question.
All right. If the tenant has an installation floater on their policy, how does that respond to a loss?
If a tenant has an installation floater on their policy, guess I'm not quite following that. If the tenant, which is, I will call the tenant the owner, and the owner has a policy for installation, the installation floater policy, it would cover that. Their interest would be covered. And if it's, let's say if we did it in the name of the tenant, the way our form reads, anything that's going to be renovated would be covered if it's there. So, I mean, I guess what they're saying is, as opposed to doing it in the name of a builder or contractor, they're going to do it in the name of the tenant. You could say that, let's say it's one of those franchise arrangements. They're going to build a fast food restaurant, and so the restaurant franchisee takes out the policy. I would make sure that the builder that's in charge, there's probably one builder that's in charge of that project, is also a named insured on the policy. Then we're off and running, no problem. Kind of getting ahead of ourselves. That'll be next month's topic too. We'll dive in even deeper to that. But so I think that answers the question, hopefully.
All right. If you are only writing the renovations, does the condition of the existing structure factor into your underwriting decision?
Yeah. What would everybody say as the answer to that? Do you think an underwriter cares about the condition of the existing building? Yeah, it's just funny. The reason I say that is I've actually been asked that question before. So yes, we do care about that. We underwrite the existing structure, whether we're insuring it or not. We, just like we do underwrite the surrounding tenants, the other tenants in the building, the other buildings next door, we underwrite the surrounding area. All of those things factor into the insurability of the risk. So because I actually have had agents say, well, you know, I know the building is in bad shape, but we're only going to do the second floor. So what are you concerned about? Well, I guess I'd be concerned about if, number one, if it burns down, or number three, if it falls down, or maybe we're doing one floor, but the floor up above us is not very sound. I would be concerned about that. So good question, but yes, we are concerned about that.
All right, Jeff, it looks like that was all the questions we have for today.
Great. All right, guys. Well, I really appreciate your time. We got done right on time today, right at 30 minutes. Once again, taking time out to hear our story a little bit is great. We'll put our contact information up there. There's Donna and me. Anytime you guys have any questions, you're going to phone call us, email us. We're here to help you. We want to write some business, so when you get a chance, think of us. And I get a lot of you calling me now and asking me questions just in general about inland marine builder's risk and things that we do. So by all means, we're here for you. So thanks again, and we'll talk to you next month. Have a great day. Talk to you soon.